Order. We're debating this afternoon E-petition 619442 relating to the Animal Welfare Kept Animals Bill, and I call on Elliot Colburn to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Hollowbone, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. On behalf of the Petitions Committee, I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 619442 relating to the Animal Welfare Kept Animals Bill. If I could begin by reading out the prayer of this petition, which states, and I quote, that hundreds of thousands of people have signed numerous petitions calling for actions that the government have included in the Kept Animals Bill. The government should urgently find time to allow the bill to complete its journey through Parliament and become law. The government promised to find time to take this bill through the next parliamentary stages so it can receive royal assent and become law, yet we are still waiting. For the government to live up to its claims to be leading the way in animal welfare, there must be no further delay to this legislation becoming law. Now, this petition received over 107,000 signatures, including nearly 100 from my own Carshalton and Wallington constituency. I'd like to put on record first my thanks to the petition creator, Jordan, who I had the pleasure of meeting last week, who I've met on a number of occasions, who's responsible for a number of animal welfare petitions that we have debated in this place. Could I also put on record my thanks to the Petitions Committee staff for the excellent work they have done to engage with the public and petitioners in advance of today's debate, and indeed the range of animal welfare charities and organisations that have approached me and I'm sure many members of this House before today's debate to brief us. So the petition we are debating today is one of many that the Petitions Committee has considered in recent years regarding animal welfare. However, the Kept Animals Bill and the petition that brings together many of these topics under one umbrella is one that I consider, and I'm sure many other colleagues consider, to be an extremely important piece of legislation. Now, I've bored colleagues many times in the House before about my menagerie, I think you can call it, Mr Hollowbone, of animals that I have, so this very much is an issue that is close to my heart. To bring the House up to speed, the bill was first introduced to the House of Commons in June 2021. It received its second reading in October 2021 and went through committee in November 21. However, it didn't make any further progress in the 21-22 parliamentary session, but was carried over and reintroduced in May 22. The bill is currently awaiting report stage, and the government has stated, both in its reply and in many times in the House, that it does intend to continue its passage through the Commons when parliamentary time allows. Now, in November of 22, when the committee decided to schedule this debate, we did write to the Environment Secretary to ask for confirmation of when the government plans to allocate further time to progress this bill further, to inform the committee's decision about scheduling a debate. I don't believe we've had a response, but the Minister will correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm grateful that the Minister is here today to update us on the bill's progress. Now, the reason that this bill is so important is that it addresses several commitments made by us, as us, I mean the Conservative Party, in our 2019 manifesto, in a single legislative step.
On that point,
I'll gladly give way.
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend for giving way, and like him, would like to thank the Petitions Committee and those who have signed the petition for bringing forward this incredibly important debate. Many of our constituents would have signed that petition, and I hope the Minister can see that from the number of colleagues that are here today that there is a real commitment from his backbenchers to get this bill going through. Therefore, does my honourable friend agree with me that given the fact that the Action Plan for Animal Welfare, which was published in May 2021, which was widely praised by the whole sector, it is therefore really disappointing that there has been such stagnation from this government, and will he, like me, urge for the government to bring this forward as soon as possible?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention, who has been a doughty champion on animal welfare issues over so many years in this place, and I do absolutely agree with her. It is disappointing that we haven't had this piece of legislation made into law so far, and I really hope that the message that we send today is that we're very keen to see that progress. Now, the overarching animal welfare issues that are addressed in this bill are including, but not limited to, the end of export of live animals for fattening and slaughter, cracking down on puppy smuggling, updating the Zoo Licensing Act of 1981, banning the keeping of primates as pets, introducing a new offence of pet abduction following the work of the Pet Theft Task Force, and reforming legislation to tackle livestock worrying.
May I intervene?
I will gladly give way.
Thank you. May I thank my honourable friend? He's most kind, and this is a really important debate, and I'm glad he's called it. This bill has great significance to my honest small constituents. I've had many letters urging the UK Government to bring this bill into law, and I fully support this bill, especially in relation to banning live exports and cracking down on puppy smuggling, as you mentioned. I'm particularly keen to support the many farmers across the UK who are impacted by livestock worrying, and indeed I introduced a 10-minute rule bill relating to amending and upgrading the Dangerous Dog Act. And I think this important bill should progress through Parliament as soon as possible. And I hope the Minister, in his answer, will reference livestock worrying. Thank you.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention. I think she makes a really, really important point on behalf of her honest Mon constituents. I want to touch very, very briefly on each of these overarching areas. I'm conscious of... I'm very grateful.
Friend, just before he moves on, and Mr. Holloway, I've explained to you, unfortunately I have to leave, and I wish I didn't have to. In his remarks a few moments ago, he said, including but not exclusively. May I, on behalf of the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation, who wholeheartedly supports this legislation, make it absolutely plain, on the record, that we don't see this as a Christmas tree, that there is not any question of it being amended to include, or people trying to amend it from this side of the House, to include things that the government does not want. So if that is a block to bringing the legislation forward, it no longer needs to be a block.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention, and I do hope that the Minister has heard that representation loud and clear, because if that is a block, then I certainly hope that his remarks have just made it clear that it shouldn't be. To go first, to delve into a little bit more detail on live animal exports. Live animals are exported to EU countries from the UK for breeding, fattening and slaughter. Now, during this process, the concern from many is that animals can undergo dehydration, starving and exhaustion, and often end up being the victims of very cruel actions which would, of course, be illegal already here in the UK. Now, our departure from the European Union makes it possible to ban live animal exports. Now, I'm aware that there are mixed feelings about these proposals in the farming community, and I'm sure this has added delay to the bill. Concerns about the impact that this ban could have on trade and business are, of course, valid. However, I hope that the Minister will be able to share some of his department's work to address these concerns and some of the potential mitigation measures that could be introduced to ensure that we are improving animal welfare whilst protecting businesses. I'll gladly give way.
Very grateful to him and congratulate him for securing this debate. I'm sure he, like me and many others, have had, on this specific issue of the export of animals for slaughter, will have had representations from his own constituents. Doesn't he agree with me that the strength of feeling is such that that really does need to be dealt with as a matter of some urgency?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for that intervention, and I absolutely agree with him. I've certainly had, and I'm sure many colleagues will be speaking about the level of correspondence they've had from their constituents who feel so passionately that live animal exports is such a cruel practice that should not be taking place. So I absolutely agree with him. Now, I want to move next, Mr Holloway, to looking at puppy smuggling. As many colleagues will be aware, and we've had debates in this chamber about this very topic, campaigners have been calling for an end to puppy smuggling and other dubious practices for many, many years. And it's been debated here, ministers have answered PQs, it's been a major committee inquiry, and there's been multiple drop-in events and campaign emails that have been organised on this subject. I will gladly give way.
Thank you very much. And again, I'd like to congratulate the honourable member for securing this debate today, because it is, as he's already said, one that has evoked enormous response in my constituency. And one of the main issues is puppy smuggling. I have visited the Dogs Trust in West Lothian, and over the period of the pandemic, the number of puppies that they had to take into care, escalated beyond belief. 2,000 smuggled dogs have been taken into care in the past 2 years, and the cost of living crisis is making the situation even worse. So would you agree with me that delays to the bill are actually helping criminals by keeping the puppy smuggling trade alive through the lack of legislation?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for that intervention, and can I also join her in commending the work of the Dogs Trust and many other animal welfare charities for the amazing work they do. And indeed, I do agree absolutely with her concerns about what delay means for these animals. Just to add some more numbers, Mr Hollowbone, onto puppy smuggling. More than 66,000 dogs were commercially imported into the UK in 2020 alone, according to Animal and Plant Health Agency figures. However, evidence shows that a recent rise in low welfare imports and smuggling activity, with border authorities seeing around a 260% increase in the number of young puppies being intercepted for not meeting the UK's import rules. From 324 in 2019 to 843 in 2020. There was then a further 11% increase in commercially imported dogs from 2020 to 21. Now, research discovers that a shocking 38% of people said that they would buy a dog smuggled from another country. So people are more than willing to support this trade than we might think. Illegal puppy trafficking is not only a concern for the welfare of animals, who are usually treated appallingly, but it is also a concern for the safety of our constituents. Now, I'm sure I'm not the only member in this House that's received multiple representations from constituents about dog theft, and puppy smuggling and organised crime has been proven to go hand in hand. An investigation in 2017 discovered that an illicit puppy smuggling market operated in parallel to legal trade. Now, I'm grateful that the government has consulted to end puppy smuggling, as well as pledging to introduce a new pet abduction offence following the work of the Pet Theft Task Force, and has been included within the scope of this bill. This section of the bill dealing with the importation of dogs, cats and ferrets has two main parts. The first part limits the number that these animals can be moved on a non-commercial basis, and the second sets restrictions on the condition of animals that can be brought into the country. Now, these proposals have been on the cards for some time with cross-party support, so I hope that we can move forward with the bill to tackle the scourge of puppy smuggling as soon as possible. Next, Mr Hollowbone, I'd like to turn to zoos. The bill states that the Zoo Licensing Act will be amended to improve zoo regulations and ensure that zoos are doing more to contribute towards conservation. Now, this includes removing the exemption under the definitions of zoos. That means wild animals exhibited in circuses do not need to be licensed. This is in addition to provisions in the Wild Animals in Circuses Act 2019 and similar legislation in devolved administrations. This would mean that no vertebrate animal not normally domesticated in Great Britain can be used in travelling circuses. It also includes amending the Act to allow the Secretary of State to specify standards for conservation for zoos and removes existing standards, allows different conservation standards to be set for different types of zoos. It would also make a licence condition for those standards to be met, allowing for those with specialist expertise in certain species of animal that are kept in a zoo to be added to the list of possible inspectors for zoos, and setting out that they can be used for periodical zoo inspections, and amending provisions for appeals and the level of fines for offences. I want to touch specifically on the issue of primates. Now, the Animal Welfare Act 2006 makes it a crime to cause any unnecessary suffering to kept animals. However, primates are highly intelligent animals with complex needs and require specialist care. It is not enough to legislate against suffering to kept animals when so many kept primates in the UK are kept in horrific conditions due to their special needs. The primate trade, although little talked about, is out of control, according to Monkey World, who are inundated with requests to rescue primates who have been neglected and by people who cannot manage them. Fully banning the trade of primates in the UK for personal pets is long overdue, and animal rights campaigners across the world are applauding the government for taking steps to achieve this. The final issue I want to touch on, Mr Hollowbone, is around livestock worrying. Results from the latest survey from the National Sheep Association found that on average each respondent experienced 7 cases of sheep worrying in the past year, resulting in 5 sheep injured and 2 sheep killed per attack. Estimated financial losses through incidents of sheep worrying of up to £50,000 were recorded, with an average across all respondents of £1,570. However, most respondents received no or very little compensation. Now, this bill would repeal the Dogs Protection of Livestock Act 1953 and set out new increased powers for the police and a broader scope of livestock species and locations covered under the legislation. Improved powers will enable the police to respond to livestock worrying incidents more effectively, making it easier for them to collect evidence and, in most serious cases, seize and detain dogs to reduce the risk of further incidents. Now, I do want to commend the work that the government has taken already to implement reforms on animal welfare, including passing the Animal Welfare Sentience Act and working on an animal sentience committee to advise the government on policies that impact the welfare of animals, announcing that it would make cat microchipping compulsory as it is in dogs, introducing new powers for police and courts to tackle the illegal and cruel sport of hare coursing through the Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Act, protecting elephants by passing the Ivory Act, and backing bills to increase the maximum penalties for animal cruelty from 6 months to 5 years imprisonment, introduce penalties for animal welfare offences, and to ban glue traps, all of which have received royal assent, and I will gladly give way.
Thank you, Mr Holloway, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this very important debate. Can I add to that list of legislation that I'm very grateful the government has been supporting in terms of animal welfare, the hunting trophies import prohibition ban, which I'm pleased to say completed its second reading just over a week ago in the House of Commons, and really do urge the government to complete the journey on animal welfare issues in this Parliament by ensuring the Kept Animals Bill comes back to report stage at the earliest opportunity.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention, and of course he's absolutely right. This is quite an impressive list. I have no qualms in saying this is a very impressive list and huge achievements that I'm very, very proud of the government for undertaking. However, the Kept Animals Bill would be one of the greatest leap forwards in terms of animal welfare that this country has seen in years. The bill enjoys cross-party support and indeed was part of our election manifesto. So I do look forward to hearing the Minister's update on the progress of the bill and outline what steps his department is taking to iron out any of the issues that may have arisen throughout the consultation phases so that we can get this bill moving again, get it onto the statute books, and truly, I will gladly give way.
Member Perry, thank him for giving way and congratulate him for how he's introduced this. Could also say to him that one of the most significant threats to animal welfare in Northern Ireland, believe it or not, is actually the protocol. As of the middle of this month, no more pharmaceutical products for animals, 50% of them will no longer be available in Northern Ireland, both for on-farm and domestic pets. That threat must be urgently addressed by His Majesty's Government before our animals in Northern Ireland are placed in any further danger.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for that intervention, and indeed I led a debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee on invoking Article 16 not that long ago, and it became very clear throughout the course of the research that we did before that debate that there was a significant impact on animals as a result of the protocol. So I do hope that the Minister could also include an update on behalf of the House about discussions with EU counterparts about the effect of the protocol on animals. I also congratulate the honourable member for getting an intervention literally as I was about to finish. But just to reiterate, Mr Holloway, I would be very grateful if the Minister could provide the reassurances and the updates that so many people here today have turned up to hear, so we can get this bill moving again, get it into law, and cement the UK's reputation as a world leader on animal welfare.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 619442 relating to the Animal Welfare Kept Animals Bill. The debate can last until 7:30. Justin Meadows.
Thank you, Mr Holloway. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair this afternoon. Can I thank the honourable member for Carshalton and Wallington for what I thought was a pretty comprehensive introduction to this issue. I'm sure many of the points that he has made will be repeated by members because they are important points and they are getting to the heart of the petition, because as we know, animal welfare is an important matter for many of our constituents, and I'm sure, like many other members here, people will have received many emails from constituents and organisations concerned about the status of this bill, which has seemingly been left adrift by government in its passage through Parliament. It's pleasing, though, to see that through the direct intervention of the public through the Petitions Committee, the government are now going to be held to account over the bill's current status. Of course, as has already been mentioned, this is an area that was a manifesto commitment in 2019. But I think it shows that the power of the Petitions Committee to be able to call a debate and to call the Minister to hopefully give us some concrete answers on the bill's status is an important positive for the way we can learn how to get government held to account through this system. And it's the opportunity for, I think, approximately 108,000 people so far to be able to ask important questions of government. And I know there have been a few personnel changes in government this year, which may be some of the reason for the delay. But I think the reason why so many people find delays frustrating is that because this bill contains so many areas of cross-party support, it shouldn't really matter who is sitting behind the ministerial desk on any given day. And I note the comments made by my honourable friend, the member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, when he spoke on an earlier occasion, he said that the government seemed to have taken inspiration from Labour's Animal Welfare Manifesto. Whilst that was obviously a tongue-in-cheek remark, I think the fact is that it does show there is an overlap in our broad positions, and that should, in theory at least, make this an easier bill to get through Parliament. Politics is often criticised for being adversarial, and whilst there are things in this bill which I think deserve greater debate and scrutiny, which I'll go on to in a bit, I think the fact that the broad thrust of it is supported ought to mean that we see this bill passed sooner rather than later. I certainly will.
Oh, can I thank my honourable friend for giving when he's giving already an excellent opening to his speech. But does he agree with me that the Kept Animals Bill will actually be quite world-leading in terms of the protection and that it will actually have against cruelty to animals? And I too represent one of the leading organisations in Battersea Dogs and Cats, and in my own constituency that is doing fantastic work on this, which also included a cross-party letter that we led on in terms of getting the government to take action. But you mentioned about cross-party support, and I think does he agree with how important it is that the bill does have so much support, and any continued delay by this government really cannot be acceptable? And he surely agrees with me that the government really must set out a timeline today as to when that bill will come back to complete its remaining stages.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention. I'm sure the Minister has noted the request, and we are looking forward to hearing what he says on that. And I think the point, taking into account the Battersea Dogs Home, is an important one because, of course, it's coming up to Christmas, and there will be, no doubt, people unfortunately buying pets from abroad, which may not be happening if this bill had been passed already. So, as we know, the bill covers a broad range of areas, including, as I've already mentioned, oh, well, okay.
I appreciate he's mentioned cross-party support, and there's lots of cross-party support. But would you accept that in some of the trade bills we've been looking at, like the Australian trade bill, we have a situation where we know in Australia you can move cattle for 48 hours without rest. We know there's multing of sheep. And we also know now we've got lots and lots of puppies or pregnant dogs coming across from Ireland who are then given cesarean and then get sent back and go back and forth. And there's all sorts of problems in the existing regime that give rise to animal cruelty that should be sorted out, in particular in terms of border control that isn't. So it's not all cross-party support.
Well, I think I'll note what the honourable member has said, and I'll just refer him to what the Dogs Trust and Cats Protection schemes have said, that they quote rampant abuse of the Pets Travel Scheme by illegal traders, which I think is really why we need action on that. And laws that were designed with good intentions to allow families to bring pets abroad have been, I'm afraid, abused to allow very young and pregnant animals to come up for sale in Britain. And I think everyone would agree, despite what my honourable friend says, that those rules in particular need tightening up. And no one wants the market for pets in the UK to be flooded with unscrupulous sellers commercially importing animals through the back door. Oh, well, I'm populous today, Mr. Oliver. Yes.
I'm very grateful, and he's making an excellent speech and is a champion for animal welfare. Would my honourable friend agree that the measures to reduce puppy smuggling in the Kept Animals Bill would also have a really positive effect on online puppy sales, the campaign otherwise known as Regizone?
Yes, I thank the honourable friend for the intervention. She's absolutely right about that. We know that the bill itself would place a maximum on the number of cats, ferrets and dogs that can be transported, which I think in itself is something that we need to be looking closely at. It sets standards on mutilation, minimum age and pregnancy. And I think that this is building on work that's happened over the last decade. But before we go down too much of an alley with that, there are other matters I wish to talk about, particularly where there have been concerns raised by Chester Zoo, which members may not be aware does actually form part of my constituency. Obviously not the main part, because that's in Chester, but parts of its land are in Ellesmere Port and Neston. Lots of my constituents work there, and actually the zoo does a lot of great work with schools in my constituency as well. And actually it's fair to say, in terms of its conservation work, Chester Zoo is a world leader. It works with over 100 partners in more than 20 countries to recover threatened wildlife and restore their habitats, and it's developing a master plan where they hope to target or have a target to halt or reverse the decline of around 200 highly threatened populations of plants and animals, as well as a target to improve 250,000 hectares of landscape for wildlife in at least 6 locations around the world. Of course, Chester Zoo continues to be England's most popular paid-for visitor attraction outside of London, and much of that success can be attributed to its visitors wanting to be part of the conservation mission. And of course, those visitors help fund that conservation. So Chester Zoo does welcome the government's increased ambition to further enhance conservation standards across the sector, because zoos across the globe contribute more than $350 million annually to species conservation programs in the wild, making them actually the third largest contributor for species conservation in the whole world. And UK zoos alone contribute 10% of that total. That is impressive. That is something we should be proud of in this country. Most of that comes from the large charitable zoos, who, of course, receive no direct public subsidy and so generate their funds from being, as I said, popular tourist attractions, Chester Zoo being a very good example of that. In the UK, in total, zoos support over 800 projects in 105 countries, providing direct conservation action for 488 species of animals and plants. So it is vital their commitment to conservation is not hampered by a Secretary of State having greater powers and flexibility, but not using them in a way that would hamper those efforts. We know the bill will enable the Secretary of State to specify different standards depending upon the type of collection, for example, a larger zoo may have, as opposed to, say, an aquarium. And Ellesmere Port and Neston has an aquarium as well, the Blue Planet at Cheshire Oaks. It's important that the power and flexibility that the Secretary of State seeks to have in this bill is used in a way that works to enhance the conservation efforts of zoos at the moment. And I understand that the bill will have a number of amendments ensuring that those standards are set for a broad range of conservation activities, and that zoos are actually incentivised to maximise the impact of those, which I think is something that we would all want to see. So I wonder, when responding, if the Minister can state whether he acknowledges that there is an issue that's going to be raised by these amendments about making sure that that conservation work is maximised, and whether he can give any assurances that that will be what the final outcome will be. Because it is essential that the government's zoo standards do reflect a broad and expansive definition of conservation that actually recognises the length and breadth of work carried out by places like Chester Zoo, much of which takes place in the zoo itself, including the world-class care by the keepers, the feeding, the bedding, the veterinary attention, the facilities, the scientific development and carefully planned and coordinated breeding programmes that are an essential component of a holistic, planned approach to species recovery. Indeed, I visited there over the summer with Mr. Speaker, and we saw some of the new species being brought back into circulation. Couldn't actually see them because they were very small, but I was assured that they were there somewhere. So we need to make sure that there is a broader understanding of zoo conservation within the revised standards. Chester Zoo as well have been working with the Ignite Teaching School Alliance to enable schools to build their curriculum around conservation. I've worked with around 80 schools so far, and I recently had the pleasure of listening to some pupils from St Bernard's Primary School in my constituency about that work they have been doing with the zoo about conservation. I have no doubt that that is valuable work as well, and it helps children increase their understanding of the world around them. And I do hope that that very important contribution to the next generation's understanding of conservation will be supported as well. So the primary concern is that by removing the conservation requirements from the actual primary legislation and giving the Secretary of State greater powers and flexibility, is that it will not have the same level of parliamentary scrutiny that we have enjoyed to date. And while the government have consulted on the reviewed standards of modern zoo practice, there will be no statutory requirements in future for ministers to consult on any further updates. So we believe that actually there should be a requirement for consultations if there are changes in the future. And the question that we have, Mr Holloway, and hopefully the Minister can answer, is if there will be changes in the future, what will the role be for parliamentarians to scrutinise and ensure that those standards maintain the levels that we see at the moment. And finally, the bill provides no statutory requirement for future ministers to involve the Zoo Experts Committee as part of any review of the standards, or indeed to formally respond to any of their guidance. The advice of the Zoo Experts Committee and decisions made by ministers should be made more publicly accountable in order to provide greater transparency. And this would be in line, for example, with the Animal Sentience Committee, which does publish independent advice to which ministers are obliged to respond. So, in conclusion, Mr Holloway, the bill as it stands will lead to the most significant changes for zoos and aquariums in decades. But there is a concern that removing conservation requirements from primary legislation, with the consequent powers being handed to the Secretary of State, will make it harder to ensure that there are appropriate levels of scrutiny and transparency about any future changes. The principle that different types of zoos should have different conservation requirements is not, I think, an unreasonable proposition, but how it works in practice is clearly of significant concern. So I think today's debate has shown so far that there is a great deal of support for this bill, and I do hope that when the Minister responds, we get a clear timetable as to when we might see it again.
George Eustace. Thank you very much, Mr Holloway. And this is a bill that I feel quite close to, since it's got my name on the cover, and it started its passage through Parliament all those days ago when I was once the Secretary of State. And I'm not going to spend all of my time going through the various issues and the matters that it covers. Others will no doubt do that. But it's also the case that this issue was dealt in some length by the Conservative Party before we put most of these measures into our 2019 Conservative manifesto. The matters contained in this bill were then debated somewhat exhaustively within government during the last session, and my right honourable friend, the Minister, was then Chief Whip and was party to some of those discussions. It's also the case that it's been debated at some length already within Parliament, having passed both second reading and also now, of course, committee stage. And this is a bill that is packed with manifesto commitments that were in the manifesto of this side of the House, the Conservatives, including totemic measures such as the ban on live exports, which we would have been unable to do as an EU member, toughening up the rules on the importation of puppies to deal with a long-standing problem there, and finally banning, for instance, the keeping of primates as pets. It's a popular bill that's got near universal public support, and I do believe that the government should now find the time to proceed to report stage as quickly as possible. Now, I know that in these situations, we may hear representations about the lack of parliamentary time, and again, my right honourable friend knows how business managers will often play the issue of parliamentary time, but I don't think a lack of parliamentary time is particularly persuasive when it comes to this particular bill, given the stage that it's got to, given that it probably only needs about 5 hours of time to get through report stage. And then, of course, it gets to the House of Lords, and our noble friends in the Lords like to be kept active. Mr. Hollyburn, we mustn't disappoint them. It's important that we keep them busy. And there are plenty of hours between 12 a.m. and 4 a.m., for instance, to ensure that this bill could be kept moving, provided it commences at the right time in the other place. I would also point out to my right honourable friend that DEFRA has already made an offer to business managers on the animal welfare space to free up parliamentary time. For as he knows, it was once the case that the trophy hunting bill was going to be a government bill, and it was decided at the beginning of this session that, in fact, we would try to progress that as a private member's bill. So DEFRA has already made an important down payment to business managers to give them time. So I think that arguments about lack of parliamentary time will be unpersuasive, and I hope that my right honourable friend's not going to make that argument. I've every confidence that he won't. But if there is a doubt about whether the government would bring this forward, I think it would be down to something else, which is somewhere within government perhaps a lack of self-confidence to try to proceed and navigate this bill through Parliament. And I do understand that, and I want to address some of that now. I will give way.
I'm grateful my honourable friend for giving way, and I have to say he has been a very strong advocate for animal welfare improvements over many, many years. And although it's been infuriating at times that it has taken so long to get some of the things through Parliament, he has done so with great insight and interest in these matters. But does he not agree with me that it is slightly strange that we have a situation where this bill, which is supported wholeheartedly by all the animal welfare charities, is being delayed in parliamentary time, and yet we're finding parliamentary time for the genetic technology bill, where animal welfare charities do have concerns, and that is racing through both houses?
Well, my right honourable friend makes an important point. I would find time for both of them, because I'm also very committed to the genetic editing bill as well. But I do understand that animal welfare issues can be contentious, they can be emotive issues. And for veterans of the last Parliament, some may recall that when the EU Withdrawal Act was being passed, there was a controversy about whether some largely irrelevant recitals in EU law about the existence of animal sentience should be brought into a British Act of Parliament. And at that time, the legal advice was that these words would behave in a very different way when placed in a British Act of Parliament than they would as some benign, largely irrelevant recital in EU law, and that therefore we had to think more carefully about how to do that. And at the time, many Conservative MPs would have received Twitter abuse from people saying, "You've just voted to say animals don't feel pain." In fact, that was always a lie. No member of this House voted to say such a thing. But what people did vote to say is that the way the EU clause was drafted did not work correctly in UK law, and that's why we had to revisit this. And that's exactly what we did with the Animal Sentience Bill. And when the Animal Sentience Bill came forward in the first session, yes, there were anxieties that this could become a Christmas tree bill, that there'd be all sorts of difficult amendments. But, you know, in the end, it progressed really without incident. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the Animal Sentience Bill turned out to be perhaps the least controversial bill that the government passed in the last session. The Animal Sentience Committee is now about to be set up. It already has, in Michael Seals, a sensible, illustrious chair, and it is ready to go. And I think we can avoid this animal welfare bill becoming a Christmas tree bill. It is open to government to determine the long titles of bills to ensure that they remain focused on the subject matter that government intends to address. This issue was thought about at some length when we designed the structure of this and other bills. And as a result, the Animal Welfare Kept Animals Bill actually has a very tight long title, and that is by design, not by accident. It's also the case that a huge amount of thought has already been given within the department to a handling strategy to help navigate this bill through its various stages of Parliament. I won't go further since I've had discussions, I know, with my right honourable friend on that, and I don't want to give away what a concession strategy might be to those here. But it is the case that virtually every conceivable amendment that might be made to this bill has been thought about in advance and can be managed. And I would simply say that some of us voted to leave the European Union because we really wanted to take back control. We wanted to make our own laws again. We wanted to be a genuinely self-governing country once again. But with that comes a responsibility in some ways, and that is we can't just hide behind the EU and expect them to do our dirty work or do difficult, contentious things on our behalf, as we often used to on animal welfare issues. We can't just blame the European Union anymore. We actually have to take ownership, including taking ownership of difficult, contentious, or even emotive issues. And we have to challenge ourselves to avoid a tendency to duck and dive and get by without tackling those difficult decisions. So I hope that the government will have the courage to grasp this bill, move it forward, recognising that there could be some emotive or contentious issues that can be managed. And I believe that Parliament must be mature enough and must develop the maturity to be able to debate these issues sensibly. And I think there is a good precedent in terms of what happened with the Animal Sentience Bill, that members on all sides of the House, yes, put down probing amendments, but recognised that ultimately they had to be sensible and responsible to ensure that the bill entered the statute book. So I believe we can do this. I would say to my honourable friend, yes, there are a number of probing amendments that helpful backbenchers have put down, including helpful backbenchers on his own side. But he should not be spooked by that. And I would simply say that as somebody who started this bill, I'm willing to help the front bench and play my part to ensure that we can manage these probing amendments, help explain to certain honourable members why certain amendments might not be necessary after all, so that we can... I will give way.
Yeah, thank you, my right honourable friend, for raising issues of Brexit within his observations. I know he will be aware, but I will emphasise them here, of the absolute fiasco that happened at Ramsgate Port back in September 2012, where over 40 animals had to be euthanised because of the appalling vessel that was used for the cross-channel activities in live animal exports. This has been a stain on Ramsgate and many activists, and I really do salute the Kent Action Against Live Exports who've kept this alive. And I know he came down and joined me one day to see what was happening there. They're frustrated that post-Brexit this hasn't been progressed with, and I'm sure he would recommend with me that the government does take this to a conclusion sooner rather than later.
Well, I very much agree with my honourable friend. Indeed, I remember visiting his constituency in Ramsgate and also having to deal with that particular case where it's even worse than he says, Mr Holloway. It's the case that Thanet District Council had to pay over £2 million compensation to the foreign company that took them to court for trying to put in place a localised ban. That's the kind of thing that used to happen when we were in the European Union. We have the power now to prevent that happening, and that's why I would urge my right honourable friend, the Farming Minister, to work with us, to work with his own benches. We're all on his side to try to make sure that we can carry this bill through Parliament. We only need about 5 hours for report stage, and members of the other side as well, and I will give way finally before I finish.
Will he, though, accept that because of the sort of botched Brexit we've had, we've ended up with a situation where we have been forced to have these Australian trade deals that he's criticised at rapid pace that will give rise to importing badly treated animals. And what I mentioned earlier about the problems of pregnant dogs coming over and being abused at great scale is again a result that we haven't got harmonised border control that we'd have in a single market. So the idea whether we're better off is absurd.
Well, I don't want this debate to drift too far into the historical question about whether or not we should leave the European Union, but suffice to say I strongly disagree with the honourable gentleman. I want us to have an independent trade policy, but I want us to have a more muscular approach to those trade agreements, and that was the point that I was making some weeks ago. But Mr Holloway, as I say, I hope that my right honourable friend, the Farming Minister, will find the time within the next few weeks to be able to take this bill through to report stage.
Emmy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr Holborn. First of all, can I say that at the very outset that this is an issue which I'm sure all of us have received numerous letters from constituents about, because animal welfare is at the heart, I think, of the views of many of the ordinary people in this country who want to see animals treated decently, who expect the laws to ensure that animals are treated decently, and the government, of course, now has the power to do that. And I just want to make a couple of points. First of all, in relation to this, how slow this legislation has been. And maybe could I say at the very outset, Mr. Holborn, that while I'm speaking on this, many of the provisions of this bill cannot and will not apply to Northern Ireland. My colleague from North Antrim has already pointed out how the impact of the protocol will affect the ability to treat animals, because veterinary medicines, etc., will not be available. But some of the provisions of this bill will not even be allowed to apply to Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland, remaining part of the single market, will still be subject to single market rules, and therefore many of the restrictions on either exporting animals or importing animals cannot apply, because they will be regarded as restrictions to trade within the single market. Even though we remain part of the United Kingdom, nevertheless, EU law on the movement of animals and goods still applies to Northern Ireland. But having said that, I still support the issues within this bill. And I think there has been some bemusement from those who signed the petition, and indeed from speakers in the debate so far, as to why a commitment which was made in a manifesto, an action plan which was drawn up, a bill which was written, and then legislation which started to proceed through the House, has suddenly, towards the end of its stages in the House of Commons, has suddenly been stopped. And I would have thought, from the government's point of view, especially given that there's cross-party support for the bill, that there is widespread public support for the bill, that many of the sectoral interests are supportive of the bill, and many of the groups which are campaigning for changes in animal welfare have already given their assent to the terms of the bill. I think that many people will be bemused as to why, at a time when the government ought to be looking for as much goodwill as it can possibly obtain, given some of the other difficulties which it's facing, why has this bill suddenly not moved forward? And I think that it will be good to hear from the Minister what the rationale is. And I can't accept the argument that it's due to the fact that there's not sufficient parliamentary time. I think that one only has to look at the number of times in the last number of weeks Parliament has closed early. There's certainly been time. Yeah. OK, it was unplanned closure of the business. But nevertheless, I'm sure those who are organising the parliamentary timetable can give cognizance to the fact that we haven't always seen the full time through every day. And secondly, of course, prioritising legislation. And I would have thought that legislation like this would have been a priority for the government. I think that secondly, and it's already been mentioned, one of the things which the government dearly wants to do is to show that Brexit has worked. And a number of times that ministers have been asked, give us some of the benefits of Brexit. Well, here is a bill which illustrates the benefits that we can, as a nation, obtain from the fact that we are no longer subject to some other body making law in the United Kingdom. We can make the law ourselves. We don't have to worry that some European nations don't want to have a ban on the live export of animals. We can make that decision ourselves. We don't have to worry. And it was mentioned about dogs being brought from abusive situations in the Irish Republic into the UK, the pregnant dogs having caesareans, etc. That, of course, because of the free movement of goods and animals within the EU, could continue to happen. But this government has got an opportunity to stop it happening now. And so the first point I want to make is, look, there's a manifesto commitment. There's a willingness by other parties to cooperate with the government on this issue. There's a general public support for it. There's sectoral support for it. There is no reason why the government should be afraid of bringing this forward. Will there be amendments? I don't doubt that with any legislation people will bring amendments forward if they're reasonable. There's no harm in accepting them. If they're not reasonable, then argue against them. And the government's got the votes to ensure that no unreasonable amendments go through. So I think that many people will be asking, why do we not go ahead with this legislation? Of course, the other important thing, Mr. Holborn, is the benefits which this legislation will bring. And I think of farmers in my constituency who have in the past made representation to me about sheep worrying, etc., and the losses and the stress, and that's not just a financial loss, by the way, because most farmers love their animals. They care for their animals. They don't want to see them abused by dogs worrying them or whatever. And apart from the financial hardship, this whole aspect of animal worrying by dogs is something which concerns the farming community. And here we have a piece of legislation which I believe would benefit the farming community, and which also ensure that those who are responsible, either because they let their dogs roam free or because they take them into situations where they know they should have them under control and don't have them under control, at least there would be greater powers for the police to investigate them and also to levy punishment on them. On the whole issue of puppy smuggling. And how many families, especially given the prices which they pay for some breeds now anyway, buy a puppy, believe that they're buying it with proper paperwork and proper protection, etc., only to find that the dog which they love and have grown to love is not been properly treated before it was they purchase it, and they find that either they've got costly vets bills or else have to lose the dog altogether. Again, protection for those people. Protection for the dogs as well, who are in some cases mutilated and can be brought into this country because they're brought in non-commercial vehicles. And the very fact that the figure that one of the other members gave, that an increase in 260% detection of dogs being brought, or animals being brought into this country, not complying with the rules, shows that because of the increased demand, the increased price, the profitability of the trade, that there are criminals who are prepared not only to break the law, but also to harm animals in pursuit of their profits. This bill at least would deal with that. And the last point I want to make, because I've had a number of constituents whose dogs have been stolen. Currently, somebody lifts a dog from your garden and it's treated in the same way as if they lifted a garden gnome from your garden. It's inanimate. And yet the impact that has on families, and also the impact it has on an animal, taken away from an environment which it knows into an environment which it doesn't know, sometimes taken to be ill-treated as well. It is important that we have legislation and improve the legislation. So I would just say to the Minister in closing, Minister, there are good reasons, if you could put it like this, selfish reasons why the government should pursue this legislation and get it through. There are also good reasons of animal protection and for protecting individuals who have animals which they love. And I would hope that we will get a positive response from them. And secondly, of course, I would emphasise this again, and I emphasise this every time I speak in the House of Commons. It's important that Northern Ireland be included in UK legislation. And that's why it's important that all efforts are made. I know it's not the responsibility of the Minister who's answering today. All efforts are made to ensure that the impact of the protocol is removed from Northern Ireland.
Chris Loader.
Thank you, Mr Holborn. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate this afternoon. First of all, if we run the full 3 hours, Mr Holborn, I'd like to apologise for having to leave a little early. I'd also like to thank and congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, for presenting this petition to the House in the way that he has done, in such a compelling manner. Mr Holborn, I should also inform the House of my interest as a tenant bee farmer's son in my home constituency of West Dorset. And finally, I would like to thank all those of you at the back, the RSPCA, the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation, Battersea Cats and Dogs Home, and all the others I've forgot. I'm so sorry about that. But we're really grateful for all the briefs and so on that you've let us have, both for this debate and for the previous 3 years, for those of us who've been in Parliament since 2019, who've been championing the animal welfare cause, and we really very much appreciate it. Mr Holborn, back in 2020, I brought a private member's bill to this House. It was the Animal Welfare Sentencing Bill. It was a bill that went through into law, and it increased the maximum sentence for those who commit cruelty to animals from 6 months to 5 years. It was one of those bills that, like this one, I think, widely supported across the House. There was no one that voted against it. I was very pleased about that because we were a bit short for time. But it went through. And today, in England and Wales, we have people who have been cruel to animals that are now spending a lot longer in jail because of it than they would have done before. In that, in my second reading speech on the floor of the House of Commons, I also talked about how important it is that we as a country look to address the live export of animals for fattening and slaughter. In that debate, I also clearly articulated the evidence that I think the BBC brought forward, that animals, primarily cows, that have been raised in the United Kingdom were found as part of an investigation to be slaughtered in Lebanon and Libya and even further afield. That is the reason why we need to bring this bill back to the House of Commons and get it through. Because organisations, the Honourable Member for South Thanet, who's not in his place at the moment, made reference to the Kent Action Against Live Exports. They're a group that deserves huge tribute for all the work that they have done. They have shone a light on the most disgraceful situations and conditions that our animals have been forced to endure, having to travel hours and hours and hours all the way down through to southern Europe. This is not acceptable. And I think it's important that we do recognise that whilst there are some in the House that disagree about the value of leaving the European Union, the reality is that being part of the European Union required freedom of movement for goods and services, and animals, including cows and sheep, are part of that. Honourable members previously to my contribution in this speech have made the point very soundly, in my view, that we are now in the position to be able to control our own laws in this respect, and the government should not hang on a moment longer than it absolutely needs to, in order to grasp this issue. In West Dorset, Mr Holborn, I have also had countless very, very sad cases of where animal worrying by dogs has led to the death of sheep and cows. Gladys, the Highland cow, died very, very sadly. She had an unborn calf by falling off the edge of Egerton Hill, which was a very steep drop, and she died as a result of that. That meant that this matter is very live to my constituents in West Dorset, because there are many of us
that have campaigned on this issue for a long time. I started that campaign as part of my private member's bill and continue to this day. I understand very much that the government has got a lot of work to do. I'm very pleased the government has got a lot of work to do, but I don't think that we have so much work that we can't just fit in an extra few hours. I would just like to place on record, Mr. Hollowbone, and I'm very happy to tell the Chief Whip afterwards, I would be very happy to spend a bit longer here on a Friday if necessary to get this bill through, because it is so important that we do so. Mr. Hollowbone, I would just like to conclude my remarks by once again thanking all those who have campaigned so vigorously and in support of so many of us on the animal welfare agenda. I petition my right honourable friend and minister to take heed of these concerns, and I should be delighted to hear from him or indeed any member of the government in the event of me being able to help any further than I already am to bring this bill back to the House urgently. Thank you.
Elaine Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Hollowbone, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chair. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank my right honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, for bringing forward this important debate, and also the Petitions Committee for allowing the time. For those of us whose constituents have written to them copiously on this particular subject. And I warmly welcome the Animal Welfare Kept Animals Bill. Indeed, I was the Parliamentary Private Secretary on the Bill Committee at the time it went through just over a year ago. And I do very much hope that the new team at DEFRA will ensure that the bill once again gets going and that we can see it going through. In particular within the bill, I particularly recognise and keen to welcome that dogs are so much more than property. Indeed, but hopefully that pets indeed will all be considered more than property. 97% of households with pets view those pets as part of the family. This is no surprise. The UK is a country of animal lovers. 6 in 10 households have some kind of pet, and the British people share their lives with around 13 million dogs. And speaking from very personal experience this weekend, our four-legged friends ensure we go out whatever the weather, be it darkness or light, so that we exercise them. And if we are entirely honest about it, we treat them more like one of the family than the actual family. So this bill continues the work that has put the UK at the forefront of animal welfare. We are home to the RSPCA, the first animal welfare charity in the world, and now approaching its 200th birthday. This care for our animals shows in public surveys. The RSPCA found that 86% of the British public support measures to stop the illegal puppy trade, while 76% support a ban on the import of dogs with cropped ears. Since 2012, the Pet Travel Scheme, established to make it easier for people to take their pets on holiday with them, has been abused by unscrupulous pet traders. It allows you to bring in up to 5 pets per person in each motor vehicle. These traders bring in very young puppies, often in poor health and weakened by their long journey without suitable care. These are then sold on in the UK to unsuspecting buyers who often put significant resources into trying to save their new family member, not always successfully. Traders have responded to moves by potential buyers to be more responsible, who then ask to see the puppy with the mother, by importing heavily pregnant mothers. Again, these mothers are not adequately cared for, and the Dogs Trust, in its tireless campaign to end puppy smuggling, has reported that it has taken 103 pregnant dogs into care in the last 2 years. As we're in the run-up to Christmas, these numbers are increasing, with 17 taken in September and October alone. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Dogs Trust for all their work on this issue, and in particular their branch in Ilfracombe in my North Devon constituency for all of the wonderful work that they do locally. I just wish they weren't quite so busy, particularly with this issue. Puppy smuggling is worth an estimated £3 million, and I welcome the move in this bill to limit the number of animals that are brought in to 5, which will limit the amount these traders can profit from their barbarous actions. But I do hope that the government will consider supporting the Dogs Trust call to lower this to 3, as 97.7% of dog owners in the UK own 3 or fewer dogs.
I would also ask that in secondary legislation, the Department looks at bringing in visual checks as a requirement. This would further hinder traders looking to bring in very young, sick or heavily pregnant dogs. Unfortunately, there is evidence that overseas vets are forging pet passports, so just documentation and identity checks are not robust enough to protect these dogs. Our dogs are sentient animals, friends and family members, highly attuned to the emotional state of their family. When times are tough, they support us and bring love and joy to people across the UK. They deserve our support and protection. And I hope that this bill comes back to the House swiftly so that by next Christmas, fewer animals suffer at the hands of unscrupulous traders. As a dog owner myself, I have focused my comments this afternoon primarily on puppy smuggling, but it would be remiss not to mention the concerns particularly voiced by the Blue Cross that the theft of a much-loved pet excludes cats in the bill's current format, and indeed horses. There is clearly scope within the bill to extend the theft clause, as I suspect the 11 million cats in the country are loved almost as much as my beloved Labrador Henry, and their theft would be equally distressing. And whilst horses generally do not live in most of their owners' houses, the bond between owner and horse, particularly given how long-lived so many of them are, is clearly very great. I do hope the government will reconsider theft beyond just dogs, as we are that nation of animal lovers, which unfortunately puts a value onto our pets that others exploit beyond just our canine companions. There is much to commend this bill, and I do very much hope that the new ministerial team at DEFRA will expedite its parliamentary progress to the statute books.
James Daly.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Hollerburn, and it is always the case that I agree with every word that my honourable friend from North Devon says, and I endorse every single word of what was an extremely powerful speech. I think everyone who has chosen to speak in this debate will say quite simply this is a good piece of legislation. It is a piece of legislation that is needed, and we would encourage the government to bring it onto the statute book at the earliest opportunity. But it does give members a chance, an opportunity to discuss issues related to the bill, which I think are important. As my honourable friend from Thanet North said, Conservative backbenchers will do nothing that will risk this bill going into the statute book. But we are able, I think, and quite rightly, to raise concerns and perhaps additions, such as my honourable friend just did, regarding why cats are excluded from the new offence of taking a dog without lawful authority. So I'd like to make a few comments regarding the scope of this bill. And perhaps it is my tender years in this place, and I look to the eminence of my honourable friend from Camborne and Redruth to correct me in terms of anything I am about to say which is wrong. But when I look, first of all, at the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation, who I think we all received a brief from them, I'm told this bill is broad-ranging and includes farm animals and domestic pet animals. So I looked at that as a starting point, and then I said, kept animals, what does that phrase mean? Just take it away from the nature of the bill. What does kept animals mean? And I couldn't find a satisfactory dictionary definition of that, so I went to the long title of the bill. And the bill's long title is a bill to make provision about the welfare of certain kept animals that are imported into or exported from GB. So it would appear that the scope of this bill is in relation to the import and export of farm animals and domestic or pets. But that doesn't seem to be the case, because as we just heard, one of the provisions of the bill relates directly to an offence that can only be committed within the jurisdiction of this country regarding the taking of a dog without lawful authority. So what I take from that, Mr Hollerburn, is that this bill presents an opportunity, not for many amendments, but for probing amendments, for amendments for the government to consider, which are not simply related to import or export. However important those issues are, they're important that we can look at the scope of the bill in relation to pets and domestic animals. As my honourable friend from North Devon has said, the reason why that is important is for all of us. My dog is Bertie. Bertie's my best mate. He's part of my family. And so that any opportunity I get to talk about animals and how we treat domestic pets is an opportunity. I think within this bill, the scope of the bill hopefully allows that. I stand to be corrected if I'm wrong. And therefore, Mr Hollowbone, you would expect me to take advantage to reiterate my private member's bill that I've put before this House. It is now the third occasion that I've done that. And it is very nattily titled the Pets Microchips Bill. And I'm going to very briefly say why I think that this is something that is appropriate to talk about and appropriate to at least consider to be part of the provisions of this bill. Now, Gizmo's Law, which is part of my bill, is a campaign that is run by a lady called Helena Abrahams from the Bury North constituency. Hence, I, as her constituency MP, have a duty to be here talking about that campaign. It's been going on for many years. Now, many members may know this or may not know this, but if a cat is found deceased in a local authority area, the general action of a council, not by all councils, because I'm sure some councils will be outraged at what I'm about to say, is that that cat is immediately disposed of into landfill. There is no scanning of the microchip. There is no attempt to reunite that cat with its owner. When we get back to the point of my honourable friend, that cats as well as dogs are valued members of our families, valued members of who we are as individuals, that does seem a rather a situation which we should at least look at and see whether legislation can be brought in to address that. So what Gizmo's Law has done is working with a pet food company is able to provide scanners to all local authorities in the country to give the people who work for that local authority the opportunity to scan the cat to make sure to see whether there is an address, a contact address, and then to give the owner the opportunity to come and to pick that cat up, if that is what they want to do. If not, the cat will be disposed of. And I think at the heart of a bill that is about the best of animal welfare, that is the cost is not even minimal. The cost is non-existent in respect of that. But it is a positive and could be a positive addition to this. The second part of my private member's bill, of course.
I think he does raise a really important issue relating to what's called Gizmo's Law. And I know that the department's looked at this multiple times over many years. Indeed, 4 or 5 years ago, it was a requirement for Highways Agency to actually scan, and that was an administrative requirement handed down by the Department for Transport. But does he not think that that may be something that could be addressed in a non-legislative way, simply by making it a condition of some of the grants that local authorities receive, that they actually show the due diligence to scan roadkill cats and dogs when they encounter them?
I think, as ever, my right honourable friend makes a powerful point. I would argue that legislation is the correct vehicle for doing that. Putting a legal duty reflects what I would hope would be Parliament's view as to the need and necessity for such a condition. But I fully accept the point that has been made, and that may well be another way of dealing with this matter. Very briefly, Mr Hollowbone, to bring my remarks to an end, the second part of my private member's bill is Tuck's Law. Now, Tuck's Law, when I first heard about this, my honourable friend from Penrith and Border, again, with his learned expertise in this area, would, in different circumstances, would be able to correct what I'm saying. But in essence, if a person takes an animal, as an example, and takes it to a vet, and it's a healthy animal, and they say to a veterinary surgeon, and again, this is a very infrequent situation, I would like, for whatever reason, this healthy dog to be euthanized, or to be put down. That has happened in the past, and that continues to happen in infrequent cases. So Tuck's Law is a requirement for veterinary surgeons and veterinary staff to scan what's called the rescue backup, so the chip that's on the dog, which would highlight the previous, maybe the breeder or somebody else, to at least give that healthy dog an opportunity for a life, for a different set of circumstances, to whatever the reason it is that a healthy dog has been brought into a veterinary surgeon. We should be doing everything possible, if that dog is not a threat to human beings, to rehouse it elsewhere. And it is a duty to do that in respect of Tuck's Law. Now, my honourable friend and I have had the opportunity to discuss this, and we won't turn it into a debate in respect of that. But I think, again, for a bill, and I've talked about the scope of this, which is to address directly how we as a Parliament, how we as a country view our beloved pets, whether they be farm animals, domestic or pet animals, it is an important matter that should, I hope, be considered in the round when I am sure this bill will be brought back, because this is a good bill. And I wholeheartedly support every comment that has been made so far. And the Minister, I've talked to our Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State, about the private member's bill. And at any point, if the Minister wishes to discuss it further with me, I am there at any point to discuss it. It's a good private member's bill. It costs nothing, and it adds to the great strides and the very positive strides that our government has done in respect of animal welfare since we came into power in 2019.
Dr Neil Hudson.
Mr Hollybone, it's a great privilege to serve under your chairmanship, and it's a pleasure to follow my honourable friend, member for Bury. Can I first of all declare a strong personal and professional interest in this piece of legislation as a veterinary surgeon? I'm passionate about animal health and welfare. I was privileged to be a member of the Bill Committee for this important bill, and it has my full support. It covers, as we've heard today, very important areas covering primates, puppy smuggling, pet theft, livestock worrying, zoos, and the movement of animals for slaughter. I very much urge the government to press ahead with this important legislation, and I also very much commend all the groups and organisations and charities who have campaigned in this domain for many, many years now. Cats Protection, World Horse Welfare, Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation, Dogs Trust, Battersea, RSPCA, Blue Cross and the British Veterinary Association, just to name just a few. I was privileged to lead a letter just this week to the government ministers with 63 other parliamentarians with the Dogs Trust to that effect, to actually press ahead so that we can tackle the scourge. We've heard a lot today of the scourge of puppy smuggling, and really this bill can actually try and stamp that out. In the UK, we have the highest standards of animal health and welfare, and we are a beacon to the rest of the world. And I think if we pass a piece of legislation like this, we can actually hold our heads up high and actually set an example to the rest of the world. Now, some of these things can be done in this legislation. Some can be done with a stroke of a ministerial pen or in secondary legislation as well. And I just think we just need to move forward and get some of this stuff done. Now, I'm going to focus on some of the key areas that I'd like to highlight today. We've heard from honourable members across the chamber today about the importance of pet theft. And I think this piece of legislation, so obviously dogs are the high-profile animal in this piece of legislation. Now, I've campaigned, as many of my colleagues and friends have, to actually increase the scope of this. So it's got to include dogs, it's got to include cats as well, and I think it's got to include horses, ponies and farm animals as well. The distress to owners of all animals when they are stolen, and the distress, as my honourable friend mentioned, to the animals themselves. We've got to make sure that this is all-inclusive with that. So I'd like the scope to be increased on that. The impact on people when animals are stolen, when animals suffer, when animals die, when animals are killed, the impact that has on people's mental health should not be understated. Now, much of this bill also focuses on the movement of animals. And now I sit on the EFRA Select Committee, and I triggered an inquiry early on in Parliament on the movement of animals across borders. And this piece of legislation covers a lot of that area. And I think it's very important that it passes so that we can actually improve how animals are moved and improve how they're checked and make sure that animals are not being moved in inappropriate circumstances. So to start with small animals, we've heard a lot today about puppy smuggling and also the awful practice of heavily pregnant dogs and also heavily pregnant cats being moved in and around the country as part of this puppy smuggling and kitten smuggling trade. We on the EFRA committee took harrowing evidence, and on the Bill committee took harrowing evidence from the Dogs Trust and other groups of these heavily pregnant animals. And we've heard today about being moved across borders and then caesarean sections performed and then moved back again to and fro. And actually the harrowing details, it really is so upsetting. And we've really got to try and stamp that out. As we've heard today from my honourable friend from Devon, the Dogs Trust have said in the last couple of years that 103 pregnant dogs have been taken into care just with them. So you can imagine, if that's just one charity, one group, how many other animals are undergoing this cruel practice as well. Now, currently, the movement of pregnant dogs, it's prohibited in the last 10% of gestation, or last 10% of pregnancy. And that's very hard clinically to assess that last 10%. So actually what this bill does is to try and push that back earlier into the pregnancy, into perhaps the last 30 to 50%, to actually make the transport of heavily pregnant, late gestation dogs illegal. And we need to actually make sure that we ban the movement of heavily pregnant animals, of heavily pregnant dogs and cats in commercial licensing as well. Now, another part of the bill that we looked at was increasing the age of animals that are transported. And that, for cats and dogs, very much needs to be increased to at least 6 months of age. And if we do other health things as well, like reinstating the rabies titer checks, increasing the wait time post-rabies vaccination to 12 weeks, this will actually help health protection for these dogs and for our biosecurity of this country, but actually will actually raise the minimum age that these animals can be transported. We've also heard that there needs to be set limits on the numbers of pets per vehicle. And we've heard that it should very much be 5. I actually do agree. I think there is an argument it could be lowered to 3. And it's very important that this is per vehicle rather than per person. We've heard evidence on EFRA of actually vans pulling in and then taking on extra foot passengers, and each foot passenger then has an allocation of 5 dogs. So then you potentially could get 20, 25 dogs in that vehicle. So if you actually restrict the number to per vehicle, to 3 to 5, then that would nail that loophole as well, that these unscrupulous, awful people are exploiting. Now, I very much welcome as well that this bill will have strong action on banning the import of mutilated dogs. Now, we've heard today about ear cropping. Now, ear cropping is a horrific procedure that is banned, quite rightly, in this country. And it is done for no clinical reason whatsoever. And it is a cruel and painful process to merely get these dogs to have their ears, erect like that for cosmetic or visual or aesthetic reasons. It's awful. It's hideous. Yes, I will give way.
Thank you. But we in the Petitions Committee did do a piece of work and indeed did a debate in this chamber about ear cropping. And one of the really worrying bits of evidence we received was the fact that young people were being encouraged to buy these dogs because whilst of course their import is illegal, they can be bought if they're already in the UK. That actually one of the big problems was that celebrities and big public figures were promoting and making it a very attractive thing to buy an ear crop dog. Does he agree with me that as part of the government's action in this space, it really needs to crack down on the glorification of ear cropping if we're going to tackle it, as well as bringing in this legislation?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I completely agree. He read my mind. I was just about to cover that point. But I totally agree that we need to make sure that it's not normalised in society. And the fact that it is illegal in this country and it's still legal to import these mutilated dogs means that these dogs are still coming in. And then also awful people in this country are potentially mutilating dogs in this country. And there is evidence to suggest that that is going on. And that's not done by vets. That's not done with any form of anaesthesia or analgesia. That is an evil process that's mutilating these dogs, and that needs to be stamped out. Now, 6 out of 10 small animal vets have seen ear crop dogs in the last year, and the RSPCA report there's been an 86% increase in the last year. As my honourable friend has just mentioned, we should not allow this to be normalised in popular culture, with celebrities advocating them. And maybe the celebrities don't really realise the horrific procedure that their pet has had done to them. But people looking at these dogs think that they are something that's acceptable. And we've normalised that in society. Now, one of my favourite films, animated films, is the wonderful film Up. But if you actually look at some of the dogs in that film, they are cropped dogs. And I was really, really disheartened this year. So Up is a few years old now. There was another one of these, wonderful animated films came out this year called Super Pets. And if you look at the poster and you look at one of the lead dog characters in that film, it's a cropped dog. So we're normalising it in popular culture. And this is a horrific process, and we need to stamp it out. So this bill could stop that in this, the dogs coming into this country.
Now, as we've heard from honourable members as well, let's not forget about the cats. So let's not forget about heavily pregnant cats being smuggled as well, and also the mutilations that some people do to cats outside this country. And I'm talking about declawing, which is actually just chopping the claws off. And that is illegal and banned in this country, but it's still legal to import cats that have been horrifically declawed. So let's not forget about the cats. Also, we've heard today about the importance of checking animals as they're coming into countries and across borders for diseases. Now, there have been increased reports of canine brucellosis in this country as well, and that's a zoonotic disease, so a disease that can be transmitted from animals to people. And there's been a case of a human who's caught that from a dog that's been imported. So we've got to make sure that we are doing pre-import checks and screenings for animals that are moving across borders. Talking about other diseases as well, like babesiosis, echinococcus, leishmaniasis. We need to make sure that we are pre-import screening animals coming into this country. And we can do simple things as well, like reinstating mandatory tick treatments and tapeworm treatments of some of these companion animals coming into the country. We have to be cognizant in this country of our own biosecurity of the animals in the UK and also public health, because, as I've said, some of these diseases can be transmitted from animals to people. So this will protect the travelling animals, this will protect UK animals, and it will protect people, and it will protect animals large and small. Now, to promote animal welfare, you need to have healthy animals. And the Minister knows my stance on this because I keep pressing him hard on this. We, at the moment, are in the midst of the avian influenza outbreak, and the Animal Plant Health Agency is really coping admirably in this dreadful situation. But we very much need to make sure that the APHA is adequately funded and resourced and staffed moving forward. Heaven forbid we get something else coming into this country like foot and mouth disease, African swine fever, African horse fever. APHA will be really stressed. So we need to make sure that the government, the Treasury funds APHA moving forward. Now, I sit on EFRA, and I was able to guest onto the Public Accounts Committee when they looked at the National Audit Office report on the APHA site down in Weybridge in Surrey that needs a radical refurbishment to the order of £2.8 billion. Now, government has committed around £1.2 billion. It's a lot of money in these tight fiscal circumstances, but I firmly believe that we need to fund this moving forward. Just moving on to some other animals as well, larger animals that should be sort of covered with this. We're talking about movement of animals across borders. We're talking about horses. Now, not one horse is moved legally from the UK to Europe, legally for slaughter, but it's likely that thousands are moved illegally. And on EFRA committee, on our animal movements across borders, we took harrowing evidence on that. That needs to stop, and this sort of legislation can actually control that. We need to improve the equine identification, and we need to improve digital monitoring of this as well. I welcome that this bill does cover the live export of livestock, and specifically to stop the movement of farm animals for slaughter and fattening. But we need to make clear and need to specify that as well, that it's all right in certain instances to be moving animals around for breeding purposes as well. And that is very, very complementary in terms of movement of animals. So we need to make sure that that works. What we need to do in this country is very much work together to improve the transport conditions of our animals. As I say, we have very, very high standards in this country, and we should be very proud of that, but we need to work to improve our transport conditions. It's very important that animals, farm animals, are slaughtered very close to where they are reared. One of the recommendations from our EFRA report was about the need to bolster the abattoir network in this country. And I attended a roundtable last week with the Minister talking about the importance of supporting the UK's small abattoir network so that animals can be reared, slaughtered, and then bought locally, so you can eat local and buy local. And that's so important that you can then reduce the transport distances for animals, and that's something that we need to do. So I'm very proud that the Conservative government has a very strong record on animal welfare, and we've heard about some of that today by Honourable Friend with his private member's bill on stronger sentencing for animal cruelty cases. That has been passed into legislation. The animal health and welfare pathway in the new environmental land management scheme, in terms of the new way that farmers and land managers are rewarded public money for public good, animal health and welfare is recognised as a public good. And that is something that we should be very proud of as well. The Sentience Act that my right honourable friend, the former Secretary of State, talked about as well, has come into law. And that is so important that we recognise these animals as fully sentient beings. So I should be very proud as Conservatives that we are driving forward a lot of this. But we need to just hold our nerve and just keep going. Let's go back to our manifesto, much of which this bill would very much address. Animal welfare unites us across this House. It unites us in humanity. So I think it's the right and moral thing to do for these sentient beings, these wonderful sentient beings that we have a duty of care to. And to quote a famous sports brand, I just say to the government, just do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holloway. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I very much welcome this debate and the chance to highlight why it's vital we get this bill back on the floor of the House of Commons. And as someone with a long-term interest in animal welfare policies, I was delighted to see the bill come forward, and credit really should be given to the leadership of my right honourable friend, the member for Camborne, Redroof and Hale, in doing so, and as he outlined some of the challenges he overcome to make sure this was there and this became before us. Yet we cannot let this great work go to waste by simply not bringing this bill back for its report stage and third reading. We need to remember why this matters, and one of the reasons this government was elected with the clear majority it received in 2019 was its move to embrace animal welfare goals. Gone was the distracting pledge from 2017 to waste time holding a vote on repealing the Hunting Act. In its place were pledges to improve animal welfare and tackle long-standing issues like long journeys abroad for fattening and slaughter. The right honourable member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip in our manifesto built on the work done previously by the right honourable member for Surrey Heath in making clear conservation and animal welfare are what make a successful strategy for key industries in this country. They are not a set of alternative ambitions. In short, a government which rightly cites its mandate as being the 2019 general election manifesto must get on and deliver it via this bill. Now, as touched on by other speakers, the government can rightly point to its record of improving animal welfare legislation with some pride. The Animal Welfare Sentience Act 2022 became law in the last parliamentary session, and as referred to earlier, the government is setting up the Animal Sentience Committee to advise the government on policies which would impact on the welfare of animals. And I did share some of the reflections of my right honourable friend from Camborne, Redroof and Hale about some of the elements of EU law that were cited. And I can remember looking into it at the time when some of those debates were going on, and were people who cited it as a sort of panacea of animal welfare regulation, perhaps wanted to consider that under it, practices like bullfighting in Spain continued, even practices like cockfighting continued in parts of Europe, as it was so full of holes, you could define something as cultural or historic. Practices that have been outlawed in this country for decades, if not centuries, being lawful under a piece of legislation that some were citing as a magical cure for animal welfare issues. But there was also other areas, and again, I very much welcomed the new powers for the police and courts to tackle the illegal and cruel sport of hare coursing through the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act. Plus, of course, the Ivory Act, which came into force back in June, ensuring protection for elephants. And I know also the government has backed bills to increase the maximum penalties for animal cruelty offences from 6 months to 5 years imprisonment. I've been ably steered through Parliament by my honourable friend, the member for West Dorset. Also introduced penalty notices for animal welfare offences and to ban glue traps, all of which have received royal assent. And I'm also delighted to note government support for the shark fins bill, which will tackle the practice of finning, and the hunting trophies import prohibition bill, which are currently progressing through Parliament. These two bills will further the progress already made, but now we need progress on the kept animals bill. And there is a lot to like about this bill. as touched on already, the bill includes restrictions to crack down on the low welfare movements of pets into Great Britain and includes powers to introduce new restrictions on pet travel and the commercial import of pets on welfare grounds, such as increasing the minimum age at which dogs can be moved for non-commercial purposes or commercially imported into Great Britain, as well as prohibiting the importation of heavily pregnant dogs and dogs which have been subjected to low welfare practices such as ear cropping or tail docking, and the impacts of which well pointed out by the member who's just spoken. And the bill also proposes to reduce the number of pet dogs, cats and ferrets that can travel to Great Britain in one non-commercial movement to 5 pets per vehicle, again helping to start removing a potential loophole which can be exploited by the unscrupulous. Now, we know the transport of animals can have serious negative effects on the animal's welfare, especially over very long distances, due to a variety of factors such as distress, injury from unsuitable transport, hunger, dehydration and heat-cold stress. We know there's been long-standing public and parliamentary concern over the welfare issues arising from this trade, with some of us able to remember the protests back in the 1990s on these issues, including in Plymouth near the docks. And the commitment to end excessively long journeys for animals for slaughter, in fact, was right. And delivering this now, we are outside the European Union, is something which shows a change which can be made, and doing it only was permitted because we couldn't change the law under single market rules. And, we do now, I think, really want to see the progress. And I'd also remind the Minister that it was over 11,000 responses were received in the government's consultation on this issue, with 86% of residents agreeing livestock and equine export journeys for slaughter and fattening were unnecessary. Now, we're turning to the issues that have already been raised around primates. I think we can all agree that primates are not suitable pets, and the law should now reflect this. I note that the Kept Animals Bill would introduce new prohibitions on the keeping, breeding and sale of primates, so that only those holding a relevant licence will be permitted to keep and breed them. And the sale of such primates would only be permitted if the recipient is a relevant licence holder, ending the ability to buy one out of curiosity or to simply keep them at home as a pet. And I do believe that a new primate licensing regime will ensure people who are permitted to keep primates provide them with high welfare conditions akin to those provided by licensed zoos, and that this would involve regular inspections and be enforced by local authorities, again emphasising the need to get this bill back to the floor of the House. And as touched on already, there would be measures in there to deal with livestock worrying, an issue which regularly affects rural communities across Devon. And all these aims are worthy, and I also hope, of course, we could see our animal welfare work go a little bit further in other areas. For example, a ban on the import and sale of foie gras, the production of which has now been banned in this country for many years. Now, in talking about kept animals, I should also mention zoos, and it is welcome that the bill would include updating the 1981 Act, and the changes made would include things like increasing the maximum penalties for zoos not complying with legislation, and also modernise the appeals process. And we do have to remember that zoos do not just do conservation work in the field, but the zoo itself can be a modern-day Noah's Ark for many endangered species, often providing the last hope to avoid extinction for a species which has suffered due to the effects of war, hunting or habitat loss in their native environment. In this regard, members will be aware of my particular enthusiasm for the conservation work undertaken by Paignton Zoo, part of the Wild Planet Trust, whose core aim is helping halt species decline. It is therefore important we get assurances from the government that there will be a broad understanding of zoo conservation within the revised zoo standards that may be set, and they will also accurately reflect the different ways in which zoos achieve conservation impacts. This could not only be when part of a reintroduction programme directly, but their work to inspire and educate alongside the resources they can generate. And as has perhaps been touched on already, zoos globally contribute more than $350 million annually to species conservation programs in the wild, making them the world's third largest funder of species conservation. And in the UK alone, zoos contribute 10% of this global total. And it's also notable that a 2021 study found in Britain and the overseas territories the fate of 29 native species rests in the hands of just 7 zoos and aquariums who are members of the Biaza group. It is therefore vital the work around this bill recognise and recognises and engages with the zoo sector to ensure we can not only deliver high welfare, but support a sector which does so much to conserve endangered species and inspire interest in them. Therefore, I would urge the Minister to commit to a definition of zoo conservation standards which avoids being too narrow and instead fully acknowledges the breadth of zoo conservation activities. I would also hope assurances can be given that in granting greater powers to the Secretary of State to make future changes to these standards, if they're not subject to parliamentary scrutiny, there'd be adequate transparency and accountability and consultation with the sector. It is clear the Kept Animal Bill enjoys wide support across the House, and the lines about parliamentary time wear thin when compared with the number of general debates and backbench business days we see. And I suspect even the most enthusiastic participants in such debates would be willing to see a day used for this important legislation. As outlined above, there are a range of measures in the bill I'm keen to see come into effect, plus further points which can enhance our nation's approach to animal welfare around passing this bill. This bill has a lot of good items in it which deliver our manifesto commitments and act as a lasting testament to our commitments on these issues. I therefore hope we'll hear shortly when we will finally get a chance to get on and deliver them.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Many thanks. It's an absolute pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, Mr Twigg. And I'd like to congratulate and thank the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington for bringing forward this extremely important debate through the Petitions Committee, E-petition 619442, on the Kept Animals Bill, which, as he rightly said, has 107,000 signatures. The UK is a place where I think no matter which constituency we represent, there are, prioritisation for animal welfare is at the fore. And I think he gave such a comprehensive overview of the importance of this bill to constituents in his own constituency, but right across the United Kingdom. And it's extremely important that we recognise the cross-party support that has been evidenced here today. And, during the Honourable Member's speech, he had interventions from many different parties, very positively speaking about the need to bring this bill forward after such a long delay and to make sure that we continue to work collaboratively to make it happen for all of those constituents in Great Britain. We then heard from the Honourable Member for Ellesmere and Port Nerson, who spoke very eloquently, I thought, about his own zoo, Chester Zoo, and the importance of those issues within the bill in terms of taking this forward and making sure that zoo animals have excellent welfare conditions, but also the specialist services that they need going forward as well. And then we heard from the former Secretary of State. I actually was just about to put you back into post there by referring to you as the Secretary of State. Former Secretary of State who has such experience in these matters and who was able to speak extremely comprehensively about the need to bring forward this bill, and said himself the lack of parliamentary time is not a persuasive argument and that these matters must therefore be driven forward. So it was excellent to hear from the Right Honourable Member from Cairnbourne and Redruth in that matter. We then heard from another cross-party colleague from East Antrim, who made the point that actually this is pretty much a win-win situation for government because the public are behind the bill, the parliamentarians across party are behind it, and therefore, given current situation with the economy across the United Kingdom, that this would be a very positive piece of legislation welcomed by all, and therefore why, and what are the reasons that it's being delayed. We really need to hear from the Minister on those reasons, but more importantly, we need to make sure that we address them and drive this bill forward. We then heard from the Honourable Member from West Dorset, who is an animal champion in this House, and he also referred to the excellent work of Lorraine Platt, who is here today, from the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation. Lorraine, who I consider to be a friend, although we have political differences on animal welfare, we are very much together on the need to make sure that the UK continues to have the highest animal welfare standards internationally, and that we support important legislative progress of such bills as the one we're discussing today. We then heard from the Honourable Member from North Devon, who I thought actually gave most of the speech that I had written out for myself, so I will not repeat her speech, but she was just so comprehensive in speaking about the asks from the Dogs Trust, the RSPCA and the Blue Cross, and the importance of addressing the exclusion of cats and horses in the current status of the bill, and also the importance of looking at the scourge of puppy smuggling, which is ongoing and is just a misery for those animals who are impacted, the puppies and their mothers. And we also heard then from the Honourable Member from Bury North, who has been doing such an amazing amount of work on these matters, and he referred to the work he's been doing on Gizmo's Law and Tuck's Law, which have garnered such support right across party and from colleagues in terms of making sure that microchips are scanned, and that, you know, particularly with Tuck's Law, that healthy dogs are not inadvertently put down, and that all possible measures are taken to prevent those occurrences. And then I thought we were very, very, it was just so impressive, and it was so helpful to hear for the Honourable Member from Penrith and the Borders, who's a veterinary surgeon and also has been a Bill Committee member, speaking about, you know, from his own experience, how important this is as a bill, and how the harrowing evidence has been heard in terms of his select committee involvement from the Dogs Trust about the heavily pregnant dogs that are now being smuggled into the country and then taken out again afterwards back abroad. And, you know, I worked for a long time in a former piece of legislation, Lucy's Law, which was about, you know, making sure that puppies were seen with their mothers. And I think it's just such a scourge in our society now that those individuals, where we put that legislation in place to protect puppies from puppy smuggling, they are finding ways to make dogs' lives even more harrowing by now bringing the pregnant mothers into the country and then taking them back out. So I was listening avidly to his speech, and I thought it was truly excellent. He also mentioned other aspects of the bill, including ear cropping and declawing. Declawing, I mean, can you imagine declawing pets, and what a terrible, terrible thing to do to an animal who, you know, who requires their claws is to be just in their natural environment, and they're just for their natural habits. And I think we just know from all of the speeches we've heard today how urgent this is. So I'm really beseeching the Minister to do everything that he possibly can to take it forward, because he has our full support in terms of support from the SNP benches. And I know, because we've heard from so many cross-party colleagues, that he has the House's support to make a move and make sure this goes into legislation. And finally, we heard from the Honourable Member from Torbay. I've been on my holidays to Torbay, and I didn't know that the Honourable Member represented Torbay, and it is a fine place to represent. He has been championing animal welfare for as long as I remember from coming into this House, and I thank him for that. And he spoke about the importance of zoos again, and also his work with the Ivory Bill and how important that's been in the past. And I think when we've all worked together on many of these issues, the Ivory Bill, Lucy's Law, you know, we want to see the continual progress for the public, and we want to know that we're doing our very best in this House to make sure that the UK is a place which has the highest animal welfare standards. So just in closing, I'd like to thank those organisations who do so much and who provide us with so much support on these issues, and some who have contacted me. Of course, I may have missed some when I read out my list that I have, but these are the ones who have contacted me and the ones that I'm aware of, and there are so many more in our individual constituencies. So thank you to you all if I do not mention you today. The RSPCA, of course, SSPCA up in Scotland, and I'm always visiting, and this year again I'll be visiting to give blankets for the pets who hope to be homed over the next few months in our local SSPCA. And the Dogs Trust, who I keep in close contact with, and those who I've worked with on Reggie's Law, Tuck's Law, Gizmo's Law, also the All-Party Dog Advisory Welfare Group that I was very privileged to chair up until this year, and I've now handed over to another honourable member who is taking it forward with great gusto, and Pup Aid and Mark the Vet, and of course I've already mentioned Lorraine from the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation. You're all doing a tremendous job holding us to account in this House, and we will also be holding each other to account, and we await really keenly what the Minister has to say, because I can't say often enough or strongly enough that he has our full support, and I want to see progress, as do so many people across the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr Twigg, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. And I want to thank the member for Carshalton and Wallington for moving this debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee this afternoon. And it is rare to speak in a debate which has been such a consensual and constructive debate. And it's been a real pleasure to listen to the knowledgeable contributions of all members here this afternoon. So I suppose the simple question to the Minister is, where is the Kept Animals Bill? I could just ask that question and then sit down again, but sadly I'm not going to. Because I would like to... I will be brief, but I do have a few things that need saying. Because this issue spans the whole of the UK, and I think it speaks volumes that the top 10 constituencies by signature span Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, as well as England. And I'd like to acknowledge all those people across the United Kingdom who signed this petition, including the top 10 constituencies by signature, from East Londonderry, Ynys-Môn, East Antrim, South Antrim, Mid Ulster, North Antrim, South Down, Dwyfor, Meirionydd, Livingston and North Down. We all know that involvement and engagement with our democratic processes can at times seem difficult, so I'm pleased that so many people from across the UK, including almost 400 local people in my own constituency of Newport West, have signed this petition. And I thank them for making sure their voices have been heard, and I hope the Minister will go back to the department and urge the new Secretary of State to get on with it and start delivering. The benefit of a very focused debate is there is no excuse for rambling, dithering or delay, so I will be brief, Chair. To be very clear, these benches support the Kept Animals Bill, and indeed we want to strengthen it, which is why we have a number of amendments tabled for report stage. And more than anything, we want the bill back before the House and speedily signed into law. We believe in honouring animal welfare, and we will always push for the strongest possible animal welfare policies. And these aren't just words, we do mean it, and all members who've had the chance in recent months and years to work with us know that we mean what we say. Mr Twigg, I would like to thank all the stakeholders, campaigners and organisations who work day in and day out to fight for the welfare of our natural wildlife, our animals, our pets and this country, to show real and meaningful leadership. Many of these people and organisations sent through really helpful briefings ahead of this debate, and we've heard them quoted and referenced by many colleagues this afternoon. Today, as the RSPCA in their excellent briefing put it, is a chance for this House to urge ministers to do what they've promised, to honour their word and to get things done. It's so important this bill is brought back to the House and we get it signed into law. These benches support it, the people across our United Kingdom support it, and as we've already heard today, lots of Tory backbenchers support it. So I urge the Minister, please, just get on with it. Mr Twigg, Labour not only supports this bill, we want to make it stronger and properly fit for purpose. That's why we have a number of amendments down for report stage. And I would urge any of the MPs on the other side watching to get behind our amendments, and together, let's make this bill properly fit for purpose. Our amendments tabled in my name and those of the Shadow Secretary of State, the member for Cambridge and the member for Leeds North West start with new clause 1 that looks at microchipping of cats. We talked about this at length this afternoon. Adding this to the bill would require the Secretary of State to make regulations for the compulsory microchipping of cats within 6 months of the Act being passed. New clause 14 would look at the regulation of keeping of hunting dogs and would require the Secretary of State to make regulations for the licensing of the keeping of one or more dogs used for the purposes of hunting with a view to assuring the health and welfare of those dogs. Amendment 1 would prohibit the keeping of primates as pets in England. Again, a simple amendment and one I hope that ministers will accept when it is back before us. Amendment 2 would broaden the definition of at-large dogs by requiring non-exempt dogs in fields with relevant livestock present to be on a lead to be deemed under control unless keeping the dog on a lead poses a risk of harm to the person in charge of the dog. And our final amendment, Amendment 3, would restrict the maximum number of dogs, cats and ferrets that may enter Great Britain in a non-commercial motor vehicle to 3. Now, whilst there isn't place to debate the merits of these specific amendments, I want to give the House and colleagues present here today and those outside watching a very clear picture that Labour is on their side. We understand the importance of this bill. We care about ensuring our country leads by example. Yeah, of course I will.
I wondered if in the interests of getting this bill through, she might consider not pushing some of those amendments. Since many of them are actually unnecessary, there are already legislative provisions that would enable us to introduce microchipping for cats. It doesn't need further legislation, and there's already a welfare code for working dogs, including hunting dogs, covered under the Animal Welfare Act, which her party introduced while in government. That's due for review currently. And so it's a wholly unnecessary amendment, which actually is likely only to slow down the passage of this bill.
I thank the Honourable Member and the former Secretary of State for his contribution. And I would say that the reason we've put these amendments forward is because the stakeholders coming to us to say that they want these things to be strengthened. Whilst I appreciate the Honourable Gentleman has not changed his position, I would hope that with the debate going forward, we can have a reasoned debate at report stage to understand further. We have no intention of slowing down this debate or this bill in any way, shape or form. We want to merely strengthen it and make it more fit for purpose. And that's the reason why these amendments are put forward. And that's why organisations like the British Veterinary Association talk about the Kept Animals Bill as important legislation, and the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums welcome its principle, but wanted to make a real impact. And it's so good to see so many visitors here today listening to the debate, and I pay tribute to Andy Hall and Vicky in particular from the British and Irish Zoology Association. Also, Battersea Cats and Dogs Home, where I paid a very enjoyable visit earlier this year, have made clear their concerns at the delay and dithering. In their helpful briefing written by Helen McNally, Battersea remind us that this bill completed its last parliamentary stage over a year ago in November 2021. And although it was carried over in the Queen's speech, we still do not have a set date when it will return to Parliament. So the Minister can put us all out of our misery and give us the actual date here this afternoon, which would be marvellous. James West from Compassion in World Farming shared a briefing that was very helpful and will guide the discussions we will be able to have when this bill is back in the House. Indeed, it sat very helpfully alongside Blue Cross for Pets, and thank you to Richard Woodward for getting in touch ahead of the debate. Blue Cross notes that they, alongside other animal welfare charities, are deeply concerned at the stalled progress of this bill. They go on to note that whilst the bill isn't perfect, it is a start, and we all remain hopeful that ministers will meet us halfway when the bill returns and will support all sensible and objective amendments. And I'm really grateful to Ferdy Willans and all those at Dogs Trust for the work they are doing on the horror that is puppy smuggling trade. Since 2014, Dogs Trust has been exposing widespread abuse of the pet travel scheme, and we've heard something of this already this afternoon. It's being used by smugglers to illegally import puppies, which are often underage, unvaccinated and in poor welfare conditions from Central and Eastern Europe to be sold to unsuspecting buyers throughout the UK. With the return of this bill, we will be able to tackle and end this cruel trade once and for all. And I'd like to thank Jessica Terry at World Animal Protection and Cameron Stevenson at Chester Zoo for their work and sharing their thoughts ahead of this afternoon. And it was good to meet the Chester Zoo staff and to see the important work they do just a few days ago. And I share the enthusiasm of my honourable friend, the member for Ellesmere Port and Nesson, and just how important their conservation work is. Today is a good day. We've had the chance to talk about the Kept Animals Bill. This debate has given us the opportunity to remind ourselves of the benefits of the strong, bold and ambitious piece of legislation that the Kept Animals Bill can be if we want it to be. I'm grateful to those who keep talking about the bill, to the more than 100,000 people who signed this petition today, and I hope the Minister will answer the following 4 questions. When will the Kept Animals Bill be brought back? How much longer do we have before the carryover motion that kept the bill going expires? What does animal welfare post-Brexit and in 2022 actually mean to ministers? And finally, will the ministers work with all of us who want to make sure the Kept Animals Bill is able to deliver the strong and bold approach to animal welfare that we all want and need to see? I thank the honourable member for introducing this debate, and I thank you, Chair.
Minister. Well, thank you, Mr Twigg, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and that of Mr Hollowbone, who was here at the beginning. I can also say thank you to my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, who's brought this debate here to the Chamber this afternoon. And it was also a pleasure to see the member for Cambourne and Redruth in his place, who I think we can describe as the father of this bill and the one that's pushed it forward and is a big advocate of it. I think to cut to the chase very quickly, it's going to be, I'm probably going to disappoint the Chamber in not being able to announce the date stood here at this dispatch box today, but I think we will be able to reassure colleagues who have raised a number of matters in the Chamber this afternoon and give some reassurance that it is something the government takes very seriously, is very keen to get on with. And I think what we have seen today is the House at its best is the House united and very keen to move forward, and also colleagues on this side of the House and across the Chamber being huge advocates for that of animal welfare. I've been asked on a number of occasions not to give sort of stock answers and not to justify why the bill has not made progress so far, but I think it would be remiss not to just gently say to colleagues that there have been matters that weren't in the manifesto that have overtaken events, shall we say. I think there was no mention of coronavirus in the Conservative Party manifesto of 2019 because we didn't know we were going to be hit with a huge global pandemic. There was no mention of how we would respond to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine and his illegal war and persecution of the people of Ukraine. And we've had to bring forward a number of matters that have put pressure on the parliamentary calendar, but that does not mean that we cannot deliver on the things that we've committed to going forward. And you know, the bill will make progress as soon as we have parliamentary time that will allow us to move forward, and those remaining stages will be announced in the usual way. And I know that is a stock answer, but that is a commitment to move forward. And for those that look for conspiracy theories that this is being objected to or blocked in some way, I would just gently say to colleagues that the bill was actually introduced to the House in May as a carryover bill, and honourable members may recall that the remaining stages were due to take place on the 19th of September. The reason that that did not happen, of course, was because of the funeral of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II taking place on the same day. So the government did try to move forward on that date, and I know that we'll be coming back very shortly. Now, of course, the Kept Animals Bill is just one part of the government's ambitious plans to improve animal welfare standards at home and abroad. We've made significant progress in taking forward reforms set out in the action plan. We've been overwhelmed by the support from stakeholders, for which we're very grateful for. And let's not forget all the excellent work our farmers do to follow the highest welfare standards, showing their dedication and commitment for caring for animals every single day. The Animal Welfare Sentience Act 2022 became law in the last session, and we're in the process of setting up Animal Sentience Committee to advise the government on policies that impact on the welfare of animals. We've introduced new powers for the police and courts to tackle illegal and cruel sport of hare coursing through the Police and Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022. And the Ivory Act 2018 came into force in June this year to ensure the protection for elephants. We've backed bills to increase the maximum penalties for animal cruelty offences from 6 months to 5 years, which I know was pushed by my honourable friend. We've introduced penalty notices for animal welfare offences to ban glue traps, all of which received royal assent. The government's supporting private members' bills as well, which include, already mentioned, on shark fins. And we've announced that we will make cat microchipping compulsory, and we're updating the dog microchipping regulations. So we also continue to explore evidence and consider reforms in several other areas across the animal welfare agenda. And I'm sure honourable members will appreciate that the action plan is a long-term reform agenda and we can't do everything at once. Now, what I would say gently to colleagues, if we are going to move forward, and there's been sort of hints at this, I think, during the course of the debate, we're going to have to try and progress together, and we're going to have to try and progress in a way that will make sure that we can deliver this very important piece of legislation. And I would just gently say, in what is a packed legislative programme, I'd just like to say to honourable members and to peers in the other place that parliamentary time is severely limited, and it would therefore be very helpful, and the honourable member for Camborne Redruth hinted at this, it would be helpful for those considering raising new animal welfare reforms for inclusion in the bill, or for raising amendments to existing clauses, to bear in mind the impact that this would have on the progress of the bill as it makes its way through Parliament. I don't intend to detain the House much longer, Mr Twigg, but I would say in conclusion that I'd like to thank all of those who've participated today in the debate. There clearly is strong support across the House for the measures in the bill to reach the statute book as soon as possible. And the Kept Animals Bill plays a small but significant part in delivering higher standards of animal welfare to address specific concerns relating to pets, livestock and kept wild animals. And I look forward to working with honourable members to build on our already high welfare standards to deliver for all animals here and abroad.
Thank you, Mr Twigg, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship at the end of this debate. Colleagues will be relieved that I do not intend to take until 7:30 to wind up. But I would just like to thank all honourable and right honourable members for coming and showing the incredible cross-party support there is to get this important piece of legislation onto the statute book. Indeed, we heard very much that passion from members who took part in the debate, including members for Ellesmere Port and Neston, the former Secretary of State, the member for Camborne and Redruth, who we're all very grateful came to share his expertise with us today, the members for West Dorset and the members for Torbay. Indeed, we did hear calls from the members for North Devon, for Bury North and Penrith at the border about how this bill could go further, but I think it's very clear that we all want this bill to get onto the statute books, and we'll do everything we possibly can to get it there as soon as possible. If I could just add a plea to the Minister to particularly take away the point about the Northern Ireland Protocol and the impact that that has on implementing much of this piece of legislation in Northern Ireland. I would just remind colleagues that when we talk about the transporting of animals, we're not just talking about commercial arrangements here. Many domestic animal movements have been impacted by the protocol. If I could just pick on the example of those who keep poultry, for example, are finding it very hard. Whilst avian flu has obviously had a real impact on the ability to show poultry at shows, there has been much concern from those living in GB about the ability to take their birds and attend, for example, the Ulster Federation show in Northern Ireland. So if I could just ask the Minister to make sure that DEFRA is doing all it can to make sure these are represented at the highest possible level when it comes to discussing the protocol. Could I just end by thanking the petitioners, those in the public gallery, for coming along today, and the work of the Petitions Committee staff in putting on this debate today. We are all very, very keen, I think it's clear to say, Mr Twigg, to get this on as soon as possible. In fact, my honourable friend, the member for Penrith and the Border, nicked a very good slogan, which I was tempted to repeat, but as Brexit's come up quite a lot during the course of this debate, perhaps if I could just nick another slogan, and let's get this bill done, Mr Twigg.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 619442 relates to animal welfare kept animals bill. As many as of that opinion say aye, of the contrary no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.